What looks like a perfect CEO life shatters the moment he turns his back on his pregnant wife and replaces her with a glamorous model, believing money and power can erase every consequence. He thinks she will disappear quietly. He is wrong. Years later, she returns with a young son, a calm strength forged through loss, and a powerful billionaire standing at her side. Not as a weapon, but as proof that she survived. What follows is not revenge fueled by rage, but a collision of truth, accountability, and dignity that reveals how power truly falls apart. Let us know what time you are listening and where you are tuning in from, and stay with us, because this story unfolds in ways no one inside it ever expected. Elizabeth Warren did not learn her marriage was over through shouting, accusations, or slammed doors. She learned it in a quiet, clinical room, where the soft hum of medical equipment still lingered in the air, and the doctor's words had barely settled. She was pregnant. The confirmation echoed in her mind with equal parts fear and fragile hope as she stepped out into the hallway. One hand unconsciously resting over her abdomen, she had rehearsed how she would tell her husband, imagining surprise, confusion, maybe even joy. None of those images prepared her for what waited at home. That evening, Richard Coleman stood in the living room of their California estate. Still dressed in his tailored suit, phone in hand, expression flat and distant. He did not ask about her appointment. He did not look at her face. He did not notice the tremor in her hands as she closed the door behind her. Instead, he told her to sit down, the same tone he used when addressing senior executives in a board meeting. Elizabeth did not sit. Richard told her he had already filed for divorce. The words were delivered without emotion, as if they were a procedural update rather than the end of a 10-year marriage. He explained that the decision was final, that his lawyers had prepared everything, and that there was no room for discussion. Elizabeth felt the room narrow around her, her ears ringing as if she had stepped into sudden altitude. When she told him she was pregnant, Richard's expression did not change. He did not ask how far along she was. He did not ask if she was well. He only exhaled slowly and said that this complicated things unnecessarily. He told her the child would interfere with his public image and the direction his life was taking. His voice was calm, controlled, rehearsed. Then he said her name in a way that stripped it of warmth. He explained that he was seeing someone else, Ava Brooks, a model, younger, publicly visible, someone who fit the narrative he wanted the world to see. He said it was better to be honest now than to pretend any longer. He said he was choosing what made sense. Elizabeth asked when this had started. Richard checked his watch before answering. He told her she had 24 hours to leave the house. The property was his. The lawyers had made sure of that. He added, almost as an afterthought, that her access to the joint accounts would be restricted immediately. She would receive formal paperwork in the morning. Elizabeth felt her heart begin to race, sharp and uneven. She reminded herself to breathe, aware of the warning signs her body had given her before during moments of intense stress. She asked about her health insurance, the plan that covered her medical visits, the prescriptions she depended on. Richard did not hesitate. He told her it had already been canceled. There was no reason to maintain coverage for someone who was no longer his responsibility. The word responsibility landed heavier than any insult. Richard moved past her, already dialing his attorney, already transitioning out of the conversation. Elizabeth stood frozen in the center of the room, the polished floors reflecting the image of a woman who suddenly no longer belonged anywhere. She watched him leave without looking back, his footsteps fading into the hallway that once led to a shared bedroom. The house fell into silence. Elizabeth lowered herself onto the sofa only when her legs could no longer support her. The realization settled slowly, brutally. She had no legal claim to the home, no immediate income, no medical coverage, and inside her, a life had just begun under the worst possible circumstances. Later that night, she learned the cruelty did not end there. Her phone filled with alerts as headlines began to circulate. Richard Coleman, prominent CEO, seen dining in Los Angeles with rising fashion star Ava Brooks. The photographs were unmistakable, his hand on her back, her smile turned deliberately toward the cameras. The timing was intentional. Elizabeth's chest tightened as she read commentary speculating about his new chapter and praising his boldness. In none of the articles was her name mentioned. In none was there reference to a wife, or a pregnancy, or a decade spent building a life behind the scenes. She had been erased before she had even packed her belongings. She tried to stand, but dizziness forced her back down. Her heart pounded irregularly, each beat louder than the last. She pressed her palm against her abdomen, whispering softly, as if the child could hear her apology. She promised she would find a way. She promised she would not let fear win. By dawn, a formal email arrived from Richard's legal team, outlining timelines, restrictions, and confidentiality clauses. She was advised not to speak to the press. Any public statement would be met with consequences. The message ended with polite language that felt colder than silence. Elizabeth spent the morning packing what she could fit into 2 suitcases: clothes, documents, medical records. She avoided the bedroom, unable to step into a space that still smelled faintly of familiarity. When she reached the front door, she paused, taking one last look at the house that had once felt permanent. Outside, the air was sharp and unfamiliar. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stay. As the car pulled away from the driveway, Elizabeth stared straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The future had collapsed without warning, leaving only uncertainty and the steady, fragile rhythm inside her chest. Behind her, the house remained perfectly still, indifferent to the life it had just expelled. And for a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath with her, suspended in a silence that felt heavier than any sound. Elizabeth Warren boarded the overnight bus without drawing attention to herself. She chose a seat near the back, close enough to the window to watch the city fade, but far enough to avoid conversation. The ticket had been purchased with the last active card she had, a one-way route out of California that felt both reckless and necessary. Her suitcase rested at her feet, smaller than her life had been only days earlier. No one on the bus recognized her. No one knew she had once attended charity galas or stood beside a man whose name now flashed across financial news. To the passengers around her, she was just another tired woman traveling alone. Coat pulled tight, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. That anonymity felt strange, but it also felt like protection. The bus moved through the night, miles ticking away beneath its tires as Elizabeth pressed her forehead lightly against the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and uncertain. She thought about the child growing inside her, about how quickly circumstances had changed, and about how little room there was now for mistakes. Fear settled deep in her chest, steady and relentless. She arrived in a small town in Ohio just after dawn. The air was colder than California, heavier somehow, carrying the smell of damp pavement and early winter. Elizabeth stepped off the bus with stiff legs and no clear plan, only an address she had found online the night before. A modest apartment complex sat a few blocks away, its brick exterior worn but intact. The apartment she rented was old and plainly furnished. The landlord did not ask many questions. She paid the first month in cash and signed the lease with a hand that trembled only slightly. The space was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every sound echo. Elizabeth set her suitcase down and stood in the center of the room, absorbing the reality of her new life. Within hours, news from the outside world reached her anyway. Her phone buzzed with notifications she had not yet silenced. Richard Coleman appeared on a morning talk show, smiling easily beside Ava Brooks. The hosts praised his success, his vision, his fresh start. Ava laughed at the right moments, her hand resting possessively on his arm. Elizabeth watched the clip once, then turned the phone face down on the table. The commentary that followed painted her as an unstable presence from his past, someone who could not keep up with his ambition. No one asked where she had gone. No one asked what she had lost. The story moved on without her. That afternoon, Elizabeth visited a community health clinic. The waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old magazines. She filled out forms slowly, careful to answer every question honestly. When the nurse called her name, Elizabeth felt a flicker of relief, just hearing it spoken aloud. The doctor confirmed that the pregnancy was progressing normally, but cautioned her about stress. Elizabeth listened closely, nodding as the risks were explained. She asked about affordable care, about payment plans, about what would happen if complications arose. The answers were not reassuring, but they were real. She left the clinic, clutching pamphlets and a schedule for future visits. Money became an immediate concern. Elizabeth applied for part-time work at the local library, a place that felt safe and quiet. The director hired her for limited hours, shelving books and assisting patrons. The work was gentle but tiring, her body already carrying more weight than it used to. Still, the routine gave her structure. At night, sleep came in fragments. Elizabeth lay awake, listening to the radiator click and hiss, her thoughts looping endlessly. She worried about medical bills, about rent, about the future she could no longer picture clearly. Sometimes she reached for her phone out of habit, then remembered there was no one left to call. She began writing in a notebook she had brought with her. The entries were addressed to her unborn child. She wrote about the day she found out she was pregnant, about the courage it took to leave, about the promise she made to protect this life no matter what. The words steadied her when nothing else did. Elizabeth learned to stretch each dollar carefully. Groceries were planned with precision. She avoided unnecessary expenses, walking whenever possible, saving bus fare when she could. The discipline was exhausting, but it gave her a sense of control in a world that had taken so much from her. She stopped watching the news entirely. The constant reminders of Richard's polished image only reopened wounds she could not afford to bleed from. Instead, she focused on small victories. A day without dizziness. A shift at work completed without pain. A quiet evening where fear loosened its grip just enough to breathe. Despite everything, the bond between mother and child grew stronger. Elizabeth spoke softly to her belly when she was alone, sharing her thoughts, her worries, her hopes. She imagined a future defined not by loss, but by resilience. She reminded herself that survival was an act of love, yet the past lingered like a shadow. Every time her phone vibrated unexpectedly, her heart jumped. Every unfamiliar car outside her building made her uneasy. She knew Richard was capable of erasing people, of reshaping narratives, until truth no longer mattered. The possibility that he might look for her never fully left her mind. Still, Elizabeth endured. Each day that passed was proof that she could. She did not know what waited ahead, only that she had crossed a line she could not return from. The woman she had been no longer existed in the world she left behind. As night settled over the small Ohio town, Elizabeth sat alone at her kitchen table, hands folded over her notebook. Outside, the street was quiet. The world seemingly paused. Inside, her heart beat steadily, carrying both fear and resolve. And in that silence, she waited. The cold came first, sharp and sudden, cutting through Elizabeth Warren's thin coat as she stepped onto the sidewalk outside the local hospital. The appointment had lasted longer than expected, and by the time she left, the sky had darkened into a dull winter gray. Her breath felt shallow, uneven, and no matter how slowly she walked, her chest refused to settle. She told herself to keep moving. Halfway down the block, the world tilted. The pavement seemed to rise toward her, and the sound of passing cars blurred into a low, distant roar. Elizabeth reached for a lamppost. her fingers slipping against the cold metal. Her heart began to race, fast and irregular, the warning signs unmistakable. She tried to call for help, but the word caught in her throat. The next thing she knew, she was on her knees, the concrete biting through her slacks, one hand instinctively cradling her abdomen. Panic surged as her vision narrowed, darkening at the edges. She focused on breathing, on staying upright, on not losing consciousness in the middle of the street. A voice cut through the haze. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Elizabeth barely registered the question before the strength left her legs completely. She would have collapsed forward if not for the firm hands that caught her shoulders, steadying her before she hit the ground. She felt herself being guided down carefully, her back supported, her head kept from striking the pavement. "I've got you," the man said calmly. "Stay with me." The voice was steady, unhurried, carrying an authority that made it impossible to ignore. Elizabeth tried to focus on his face, but her vision swam. She caught only fragments. Dark coat, silver hair at the temples, eyes sharp with concern, not curiosity. Someone called for an ambulance. Elizabeth heard the words distantly, as if they belonged to another scene entirely. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out everything else. She felt herself being lifted, supported, kept upright when her body refused to cooperate. "Pregnant," she managed to whisper, the words scraping her throat. "Heart condition." The man nodded once, already relaying the information to the paramedics as they arrived. He did not ask questions that required effort. He did not demand explanations. He stayed close, his presence a solid anchor as the world continued to spin. The ambulance doors closed with a metallic thud, sealing her inside a space filled with light and controlled urgency. Elizabeth drifted in and out of awareness as monitors beeped and hands worked efficiently around her. Through it all, the man remained nearby, his voice occasionally breaking through the fog, reminding her to breathe. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. Elizabeth was transferred onto a gurney and rushed down sterile hallways that blurred into one another. The man followed until a nurse gently stopped him at the entrance to the emergency wing. "You can wait here," she said. He did not argue. He simply nodded and stepped back, watching as Elizabeth disappeared through sliding doors. For a moment, his composure cracked, concern etching deeper lines across his face. Then he straightened, hands folding neatly in front of him, as if patience were a discipline he had mastered long ago. Elizabeth woke hours later to the steady rhythm of a heart monitor and the faint smell of antiseptic. The room was quiet, dimly lit, her body heavy but stable. A nurse noticed her stirring and offered a reassuring smile. "You gave us a scare," she said gently, "but you're stable now." Relief washed through Elizabeth so powerfully it left her weak. She asked about the baby first, her voice trembling. The nurse assured her everything looked fine, though stress remained a concern. Elizabeth closed her eyes, letting the tension ease just enough to breathe. A short while later, the doctor returned with paperwork and explanations. Elizabeth listened carefully, nodding, absorbing the information even as exhaustion pulled at her. Then the doctor hesitated, glancing at the chart before speaking again. "Your insurance coverage has been approved," she said. "Fully." Elizabeth frowned. "That's not possible," she replied quietly. "I don't have coverage anymore." The doctor offered a small, knowing smile. "Someone took care of it." Before Elizabeth could ask who, there was a soft knock at the door. It opened to reveal the man from the street, now without his coat, standing just inside the room. He did not step closer immediately, as if mindful of boundaries. "You're awake," he said. Elizabeth studied him more clearly now. He was older than Richard, but there was a weight to him that came from experience rather than ambition. His posture was composed, his gaze direct, but not intrusive. "You helped me," she said. "I made sure you got here," he replied evenly. "The doctors did the rest." She hesitated. "They said my care was covered." "Yes," he said simply. Elizabeth's pulse quickened, this time from confusion rather than fear. "I don't understand," she admitted. "You don't know me." The man met her eyes steadily. "I know enough," he said. "I know you were in trouble, and I know no one should face that alone." He introduced himself as Jonathan Reed. The name registered faintly, carrying a sense of recognition she could not immediately place. He did not elaborate, did not offer credentials or explanations beyond what was necessary. Elizabeth struggled to sit up, emotion tightening her chest. "I can't accept this," she said. "I can't owe anyone." Jonathan raised a hand gently. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "This isn't a transaction." There was no expectation in his voice, no condition hidden beneath the offer, just certainty. They spoke briefly after that. Jonathan asked only what was essential: how far along she was, whether she had support, whether she felt safe where she was staying. He did not pry into her past, did not ask about the man who had disappeared from her life. When the nurse returned to adjust her monitors, Jonathan stepped back, giving her space. He told her he would arrange for a specialist to review her case, someone who could monitor her condition properly. Elizabeth listened, overwhelmed, unsure how to respond to kindness that came without strings attached. Before leaving, Jonathan paused at the door. "Rest," he said. "You'll need your strength, our grit." As he walked out, the room seemed to settle into a deeper quiet. Elizabeth lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling, her heart steady, but her thoughts racing. She did not know why a stranger had stepped into her life at that moment. She did not know what it would mean. All she knew was that for the first time in a long while, she was not alone. And the silence that followed was thick with unanswered questions. The labor began in the early hours of the morning, quietly at first, as if Elizabeth Warren's body was testing her resolve. She woke to a tight, unfamiliar pressure low in her abdomen and lay still, listening to the rhythm of her breathing. When the sensation returned stronger, sharper, she knew it was time. There was no panic in her movements, only urgency shaped by months of restraint. Jonathan Reed was already awake when she called. Within minutes, he was at her door, coat pulled on hastily, concern evident but controlled. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply helped her into the car and drove through the empty streets toward the hospital. The world outside, still dark and hushed. Elizabeth focused on the passing streetlights, counting them, grounding herself in the moment. At the hospital, everything accelerated. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency, voices calm but firm. Elizabeth was guided into a delivery room, monitors attached, instructions given clearly and without judgment. Jonathan remained just outside, close enough to be present, far enough to respect the space she needed. The hours stretched. Pain came in waves, demanding her attention, pulling her inward. Elizabeth concentrated on breathing, on staying steady, on remembering why she was enduring this. Between contractions, she thought about the long nights alone in Ohio, the fear she had carried quietly, the promises she had written in her notebook. Each memory sharpened her resolve. When the doctor told her the labor was progressing slowly, Elizabeth nodded, accepting the reality without complaint. She had learned patience the hard way. The room was bright, sterile, focused entirely on the task at hand. There was no room for distraction, no space for regret. Jonathan waited. He paced the hallway in measured steps, stopping only when nurses passed through swinging doors. He checked the clock more times than he cared to admit, his usual composure strained by the unfamiliar helplessness of waiting. Though he had overseen negotiations worth billions, this was different. This mattered in a way numbers never could. Finally, the call came. Elizabeth's son was born just before sunrise, his arrival announced by a thin, insistent cry that cut through the exhaustion in the room. The sound broke something open inside her. Tears filled her eyes as the nurse placed the baby gently against her chest, his skin warm, his breathing shallow, but determined. She whispered his name for the first time. Noah Warren. He was small, fragile in a way that demanded protection, yet undeniably alive. The doctor explained that he had arrived a bit early and would need monitoring, but his signs were strong. Elizabeth listened, nodding, barely able to tear her eyes away from the tiny face pressed against her skin. When Jonathan was allowed into the room, he entered quietly, as if afraid to disturb the moment. He stopped a few steps away, taking in the scene with a stillness that spoke volumes. Elizabeth looked up at him, exhaustion etched into her features, and offered a faint smile. "He's here," she said softly. Jonathan approached slowly, reverently. When the nurse offered to let him hold the baby, he hesitated only a second before agreeing. His hands were steady as he cradled Noah, his expression shifting into something unguarded and deeply human. For a man accustomed to control, the weight of a newborn was humbling. "He's remarkable," Jonathan said, his voice low. Elizabeth watched them, a strange sense of completeness settling over her. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic exchange, just presence, just support, just the quiet acknowledgement that something significant had occurred. Later, after Noah was taken to be examined further, Elizabeth rested against the pillows, her body heavy, but her heart light, in a way she had not felt in months. Jonathan remained nearby, seated in the corner, giving her space while making it clear he was not leaving. She did not tell Richard. The thought crossed her mind briefly, then passed. There was no obligation left between them. This moment did not belong to him. Elizabeth chose silence, a deliberate boundary drawn for her own peace. The days that followed were slow and careful. Elizabeth recovered under attentive care, her strength returning gradually. Jonathan arranged everything quietly, ensuring she had what she needed without overwhelming her with details. There were no public announcements, no visitors seeking access, only routine, stability, and rest. Noah remained under observation, his tiny chest rising and falling steadily beneath soft blankets. Elizabeth visited him whenever she was able, her presence calm and constant. She spoke to him in hushed tones, telling him about the world he had entered and the love waiting for him within it. Jonathan watched these moments from a respectful distance. He did not interfere, did not claim space that was not offered. When Elizabeth invited him closer, he came. When she needed quiet, he stepped back. The balance was unspoken but understood. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the hospital window, Elizabeth finally allowed herself to acknowledge what she felt. Safety. Not certainty, not answers, but safety. It was unfamiliar and deeply comforting. "You don't have to do all this," she said quietly to Jonathan, breaking a long silence. "I know," he replied. "I want to." There was no pressure in his words, no expectation, just choice. Elizabeth nodded, accepting that for now. She focused on healing, on learning her son's rhythms, on rebuilding herself piece by piece. The future remained unclear, but it no longer felt impossible. As night fell outside the hospital, the room grew quiet once more. Elizabeth held Noah close, his warmth grounding her, while Jonathan stood by the window, looking out into the darkness. Nothing more was said, and in that shared silence, the world seemed to pause, waiting. Richard Coleman first sensed something slipping when the boardroom grew quieter than usual. The conversations that once flowed easily around him now stopped when he entered, eyes lowering to tablets and notes. The confidence he had carried for years no longer commanded automatic agreement. Something had shifted, and he felt it before anyone said a word. The pressure began with the numbers. Quarterly reports showed a steady decline, not catastrophic but unmistakable. Investors asked sharper questions. Analysts stopped praising vision and started demanding accountability. Richard assured everyone it was temporary, that market conditions were unpredictable, that innovation required patience. His voice remained steady, but beneath the surface, irritation simmered. At home, the atmosphere had changed as well. Ava Brooks spent more time scrolling through her phone than engaging in conversation. The excitement that once defined their relationship faded as headlines grew less flattering. Invitations to high-profile events slowed, then stopped. Ava's laughter sounded forced, her patience thinner by the day. Richard noticed, even if he refused to acknowledge it openly. The first real blow came when a major sponsor quietly withdrew support from one of the company's flagship initiatives. No public statement was issued, but the message was clear. Confidence was eroding. Richard spent long nights in his office, staring at screens filled with projections that refused to improve. He began to think about optics. The narrative he had built around himself no longer held. The image of the decisive, forward-thinking CEO felt incomplete, hollow. Somewhere along the way, the absence of a family had become noticeable. The media had once celebrated his independence. Now they questioned his stability. That was when Elizabeth Warren resurfaced in his thoughts. Not as a person, but as a solution. Richard remembered the pregnancy with sudden clarity, the way he had dismissed it as inconvenient. He calculated timelines, dates, possibilities. A child meant continuity, legacy, redemption, if framed correctly. The realization unsettled him, not because of guilt, but because of opportunity lost. He ordered a background search. The instruction was delivered quietly through trusted channels, framed as routine due diligence. Richard wanted to know where Elizabeth had gone, what she was doing, whether the child existed. Days passed with no results. No social media, no public records that connected easily. It was as if she had vanished. The lack of information unnerved him. Ava sensed the shift in his attention immediately. She asked pointed questions, her tone sharper than before. Richard dismissed her concerns, but the distance between them widened. She accused him of distraction. He accused her of being unreasonable. The arguments ended without resolution, leaving resentment in their wake. Meanwhile, the board's patience wore thin. An emergency meeting was called, the tone formal and restrained. Directors expressed concern about leadership focus and public perception. One suggested bringing in an external advisor. Another mentioned succession planning. Richard felt the room tilt against him, the authority he once wielded slipping through his fingers. For the first time, he felt fear. He returned home late that night to find Ava packing a suitcase. She did not look at him as she zipped it closed. She told him she needed space, that the pressure was too much, that his world no longer felt glamorous. Richard did not stop her. He watched her leave, the door closing with a sound that echoed too loudly in the empty house. Alone, he poured himself a drink and stared out at the city lights. The silence was oppressive, offering no comfort. His phone buzzed with unanswered messages from investors, advisors, people who needed reassurance he could no longer convincingly provide. He thought again of Elizabeth. This time, the thought carried something sharper than calculation. Regret crept in, unwanted and persistent. He remembered her composure, her quiet strength, the way she had looked at him when he told her to leave. He dismissed the memory quickly, unwilling to linger. The investigator called 2 days later. "There's very little," he said. "She's kept a low profile. Different state. No digital trail worth mentioning." Richard tightened his grip on the phone. "Find more," he ordered. "Whatever it takes." When the call ended, he sat back, the weight of his situation pressing down on him. Ava was gone. The board was restless. The media's tone had shifted from admiration to skepticism. The future he had so carefully engineered was fracturing. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old photograph, one he had never thrown away. Elizabeth stood beside him, smiling faintly, unaware of what awaited her. Richard stared at it longer than he intended, the past pressing in on him with uncomfortable force. For the first time, he wondered if he had miscalculated. Not morally, but strategically. Outside, rain began to fall, streaking the windows and blurring the city below. Richard remained seated in the dimly lit room, the photograph resting on the desk, unanswered questions gathering in the silence. Somewhere beyond his reach, consequences were moving closer. And in the stillness that followed, Richard Coleman realized he was no longer in control. Elizabeth Warren returned to California without announcements or advance notice. The decision had been made quietly, after long nights of consideration and careful planning. She did not feel dramatic about it. She felt resolved. 3 years had passed, and the woman stepping off the plane was not the same one who had left with 2 suitcases and no certainty. Noah walked beside her, small hand wrapped firmly around hers, his steps quick and curious as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. He was old enough to sense change, but not old enough to fear it. To him, the trip was simply another journey, another place to explore. Elizabeth watched him closely, measuring her own steadiness by his calm. Jonathan Reed followed a few steps behind. Unobtrusive, but unmistakably present. He carried no air of spectacle, no visible entourage, yet people noticed him instinctively. There was something about his composure that drew attention without demanding it. Elizabeth was aware of it, even if she did not dwell on it. They did not return to her former home. Instead, Elizabeth settled into a temporary residence, arranged discreetly, one that offered privacy and security without excess. The days that followed were quiet. Noah adjusted quickly, fascinated by palm trees and the ocean breeze. Elizabeth focused on routines, on keeping life normal, on maintaining the balance she had built so carefully. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was an announcement for a major charity gala, hosted by the foundation Richard Coleman had once championed. Elizabeth recognized the name immediately. The event would draw business leaders, investors, and media attention. Jonathan read the invitation once, then set it aside. "You don't have to go," he said evenly. Elizabeth looked at the card for a long moment before answering. "I know," she replied, "but I want to." There was no anger in her voice, no thirst for confrontation. The choice came from somewhere deeper, quieter. She did not intend to speak. She did not intend to explain. She intended to exist, openly and without apology. The night of the gala arrived with all the expected grandeur. Cameras lined the entrance, flashes punctuating the hum of conversation. Guests arrived in polished vehicles, smiles practiced and poised. Elizabeth stepped out of the car calmly, Noah at her side, Jonathan beside them. The reaction was immediate. Whispers rippled through the crowd, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Some recognized Jonathan Reed instantly. Others focused on Elizabeth, her face familiar in a way that unsettled them. She walked forward without hesitation, posture straight, expression composed. Noah looked up at the lights with wide-eyed wonder, unaware of the impact of his presence. Inside the venue, the energy shifted. Richard Coleman stood near the center of the room, surrounded by associates, his smile automatic as he greeted donors. When he looked up and saw Elizabeth, the practiced ease vanished from his face. The color drained subtly, his expression freezing, as if his mind had stalled mid-thought. His gaze dropped to the child. The resemblance struck him with physical force. Noah's eyes, his brow, the shape of his face. The room seemed to tilt as realization crashed over him, uninvited and undeniable. Richard's mouth opened slightly, then closed again, words failing him. Elizabeth did not look away. She did not approach him. She did not acknowledge him directly. She simply continued forward, her presence speaking louder than any confrontation could. Jonathan walked at her side, his demeanor unchanging, a quiet statement of alignment. Ava Brooks was there as well. She stood near the bar, laughter still on her lips, until she noticed the shift in attention. When she followed the line of sight and saw Elizabeth, her smile faltered. Her eyes moved quickly from Elizabeth to Noah, then to Jonathan. Confusion gave way to something sharper. Recognition. Understanding. She set her glass down abruptly and excused herself without ceremony. The room buzzed with speculation. Elizabeth felt it around her. The unspoken questions. The glances that lingered too long. She did not engage. She guided Noah toward a quieter corner, where he could sit and observe without being overwhelmed. Jonathan stayed close, offering support without intrusion. Richard attempted to regain composure. He excused himself from his group and took a step forward, then stopped. The distance between them felt insurmountable. Elizabeth met his eyes briefly, her expression unreadable. There was no accusation there, no triumph, just clarity. He understood then that he had already lost, not because she had returned with someone powerful, not because the truth threatened his reputation, but because the life he had dismissed had grown beyond his reach, complete without him. Elizabeth spoke to no one about the past. She exchanged polite words with hosts, accepted brief greetings, remained courteous and contained. Noah stayed close, occasionally tugging at her hand to point out something that caught his attention. Jonathan watched the room with measured awareness, ensuring nothing disrupted the fragile calm she had built. As the evening progressed, Richard remained where he was, unable to move forward or retreat without drawing attention. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, every whispered glance, reinforcing what he already knew. The narrative he had controlled so carefully was slipping away. Elizabeth did not stay long. When she decided it was time to leave, she gathered Noah gently, thanking the hosts with quiet grace. Jonathan followed as they made their way toward the exit. Cameras flashed again. Questions shouted from a distance, but she did not respond. Outside, the night air felt cool and steady. Elizabeth helped Noah into the car, fastening his seatbelt with practiced ease. Jonathan closed the door softly, then paused beside her. She looked back once, toward the glowing entrance of the gala, where figures still moved behind glass and light. She felt no satisfaction, only finality. As the car pulled away, the noise faded, leaving behind a silence heavy with implications yet to unfold, waiting patiently in the dark. The silence Elizabeth Warren had maintained did not last long. It never does when the truth begins to press against the surface. Within 48 hours of the gala, questions flooded newsrooms, legal offices, and corporate inboxes. Speculation hardened into inquiry, and inquiry demanded answers. Elizabeth did not seek attention, but she did not hide. When the first request for comment arrived, she read it carefully, then set it aside. By the third, she understood silence would no longer protect what mattered. The narrative was already forming without her voice, and she had learned the cost of letting others speak for her. She agreed to one interview. It was conducted in a quiet office, away from cameras and crowds, with a journalist known for restraint rather than spectacle. Elizabeth sat upright, hands folded calmly, Noah safely elsewhere under Jonathan's care. She spoke without notes, without embellishment, her voice steady and measured. She told the truth. She explained the timing of her pregnancy, the divorce filed without warning, the insurance canceled overnight. She described the moment she was told to leave, the absence of concern for her health, the calculated erasure that followed. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse. She stated facts, one by one, allowing their weight to settle. Medical records supported her account. Documentation showed the exact date her coverage was terminated, the missed prenatal appointments that followed, the emergency visit that could have ended far worse. Legal filings confirmed the speed and severity of the separation. There was no room for interpretation. Only sequence, only consequence. The story broke the next morning. Headlines shifted in tone immediately. Where Richard Coleman had once been praised for decisiveness, he was now questioned for cruelty. Commentators debated ethics, responsibility, and the treatment of pregnant women in positions of vulnerability. Elizabeth's name appeared not as a footnote, but as the center of the conversation. Support followed swiftly. Women shared similar experiences, stories long buried resurfacing in solidarity. Advocacy groups amplified Elizabeth's words, framing them not as personal grievance, but as systemic failure. She was careful not to claim a role she did not seek. She accepted the attention only insofar as it protected others. Jonathan remained in the background. He did not grant interviews. He did not issue statements. When asked, he declined politely, insisting the focus remain where it belonged. His silence carried its own authority, reinforcing Elizabeth's credibility without overshadowing it. Inside Richard's company, the response was immediate and severe. The board convened an emergency session, citing reputational risk and ethical review. Share prices dipped sharply as investors reacted to the unfolding scandal. Emails leaked. Internal discussions surfaced, revealing concern that predated the public fallout. The image of stability cracked beyond repair. Richard attempted damage control. He released a statement expressing regret for personal misunderstandings and private matters becoming public. The language rang hollow. It addressed optics, not harm. Within hours, analysts criticized the response as evasive. The silence that followed his statement was louder than any rebuttal. Elizabeth watched the coverage briefly, then turned it off. She had said what needed to be said. The rest was no longer hers to manage. Her attention returned to Noah, to the routines that grounded her, to the life she was building with intention rather than reaction. Still, the consequences continued to unfold. Former allies distanced themselves from Richard. Partnerships dissolved quietly. Invitations were rescinded. The narrative shifted decisively, reframing his success through the lens of what he had been willing to discard. The board placed him on administrative leave, pending further review. Ava Brooks disappeared from public view. Her social media accounts went dark. Endorsements suspended without explanation. She was no longer invited to speak, no longer photographed alongside influence. The silence surrounding her was abrupt and total, a stark contrast to the attention she had once enjoyed. Elizabeth did not comment on her. She refused to be drawn into spectacle or comparison. Her focus remained narrow, deliberate. She emphasized accountability over revenge, protection over exposure. In every statement, she returned to the same point. No woman should be left unprotected during pregnancy. No child should be treated as an inconvenience. The legal implications followed swiftly. Elizabeth's attorneys filed documentation to secure Noah's rights, supported by evidence already in the public domain. The filings were precise, restrained, and undeniable. There were no grand gestures, just structure, just law. Richard was summoned for deposition. For the first time, he was required to answer questions under oath. His responses measured against records he could not rewrite. The process stripped away narrative control, replacing it with fact. Each answer closed another door he had hoped might remain open. Elizabeth did not attend. She received updates through counsel, choosing distance over confrontation. The weight of the moment did not require her presence. The truth spoke clearly enough on its own. As the days passed, the noise settled into something heavier. Not resolution, but reckoning. The systems Richard had relied upon turned inward, reassessing values once overlooked. His absence from public life became noticeable, then expected. Elizabeth stood at her kitchen window one evening, watching dusk settle over the city. The world felt strangely still, as if pausing to absorb what had been revealed. Noah's laughter drifted faintly from another room, grounding her in the present. She did not feel victorious. She felt steady. Behind her, the door closed softly as Jonathan entered, his presence calm and familiar. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to explain. Outside, the light faded completely, leaving the room wrapped in quiet, the kind that comes only after truth has been spoken, and the consequences begin to wait in silence. The proceedings unfolded without spectacle, governed by procedure rather than emotion. Elizabeth Warren arrived early, dressed plainly, her posture composed. She took her seat beside counsel and focused on the quiet mechanics of the room. There were no cameras inside, no grandstanding, only the low murmur of papers and the steady rhythm of a clock that marked each passing minute with impartial precision. Richard Coleman entered later. He looked smaller than he had at the gala, his confidence diminished by weeks of scrutiny and sleepless nights. The tailored suit remained, but the ease had vanished. He avoided Elizabeth's gaze, choosing instead to stare at the table in front of him, hands clasped as if holding himself together. The judge reviewed the filings methodically. Dates were read into the record. Coverage termination was confirmed. Communications were examined, stripped of tone and intention, reduced to actions and consequences. The room remained quiet, as evidence spoke for itself, each document reinforcing the next. There was no room for reinterpretation, only sequence. Elizabeth listened, unmoving. Her testimony had already been submitted, sworn and complete. She was not asked to repeat it. She did not need to. The facts carried her voice forward without her presence on the stand. When the judge addressed the matter of prenatal care and the abrupt cancellation of benefits, Elizabeth felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Then, let it pass. Richard's counsel attempted restraint. They argued miscommunication, administrative oversight, unintended outcomes. The phrasing was careful, polished, designed to soften edges without denying reality. The judge listened, asked clarifying questions, then returned to the record. Each answer narrowed the space where doubt might have lived. The ruling followed. The court affirmed Elizabeth's claims regarding negligence and financial harm during pregnancy. The language was precise, unemotional, and definitive. Compensation for medical expenses was ordered in full. Retroactive to the date coverage had been cancelled. The obligation was framed not as punishment, but as correction. Elizabeth exhaled slowly. When the matter of parental rights was addressed, the room seemed to hold its breath. The judge acknowledged the complexity, the child's best interests paramount above all else. Elizabeth's counsel requested limited contact and full decision-making authority. The filings were clear, the rationale carefully constructed. Richard was asked to speak. He stood, hesitated, then addressed the court in measured tones. He expressed regret for how events had unfolded, acknowledged mistakes without naming them directly. He spoke of intent rather than impact, of pressure rather than choice. His words filled the room briefly, then dissipated. The judge thanked him and returned to the decision. Elizabeth was granted primary custody and sole authority over medical and educational decisions. Richard was afforded the option of structured contact contingent upon compliance and review. The terms were explicit, enforceable, and final. Silence followed the ruling. Elizabeth did not look toward Richard. She kept her gaze forward, absorbing the outcome without triumph. Relief arrived quietly, settling into her bones rather than bursting outward. The past months had taught her the value of restraint, the strength found in calm acceptance. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. Elizabeth declined to comment. Her attorney issued a brief statement focused on child welfare and legal clarity. There were no sound bites, no celebration. The decision spoke sufficiently on its own. Richard exited through a separate door. He paused briefly in the hallway, shoulders sagging, then continued on without speaking. The world he had once navigated with ease now moved past him, indifferent and unyielding. Later that afternoon, the corporate response followed. The board announced Richard's formal removal, citing ethical review and breach of standards. The statement was concise, deliberate, and conclusive. Markets reacted swiftly. Analysts noted the inevitability, the long arc from private decision to public consequence. Elizabeth read the announcement once. She felt no satisfaction, only distance, The machinery of accountability was operating independently now, its outcomes no longer requiring her attention. She closed the browser and turned back to the life within reach. At home, Noah played quietly, stacking blocks with careful concentration. Elizabeth watched him for a moment, the ordinary grace of the scene grounding her. She knelt beside him, helping steady a tower that threatened to fall, and smiled when it held. Jonathan arrived as evening settled. He did not ask about the details. He did not need them. He read the calm in her posture, the steadiness in her movements, and understood. They shared a brief glance, an unspoken acknowledgement that something essential had been secured. The city outside dimmed as lights flickered on, one by one. Elizabeth stood at the window, watching the transition, feeling the weight of finality settle gently rather than crash. The day had demanded much, but it had given clarity in return. There were no cheers, no closing statements, no lingering applause, only a quiet room, a child's soft laughter, and the knowledge that a line had been drawn, firm and unmistakable, as the world beyond the glass fell into a waiting silence. The move was quiet, deliberate, and free of ceremony. Elizabeth Warren packed their belongings without urgency, folding clothes carefully, labeling boxes with a precision born of habit. There was no sense of escape this time, no fear pressing at her back. This was a transition chosen, not forced. Noah watched with curiosity as rooms emptied and familiar objects disappeared into cardboard. He asked questions in the simple, direct way of children, and Elizabeth answered each one honestly, without burden. She told him they were going somewhere safe, somewhere they could build something together. He accepted this easily, trusting the steadiness in her voice. Jonathan Reed coordinated the logistics with minimal disruption. He handled details without intrusion, ensuring that what mattered remained centered on Elizabeth and Noah. The house they moved into was neither ostentatious nor hidden, chosen for its privacy and warmth rather than scale. It felt lived in almost immediately, as if it had been waiting for them. The first night passed quietly. Elizabeth slept deeply for the first time in months, the kind of rest that settles the body, rather than merely stopping movement. When she woke, sunlight filtered through unfamiliar windows, and the absence of anxiety was startling. She lay still for a moment, listening to the sounds of a household beginning its day. "Downstairs," Noah laughed. The sound carried through the house, light and unrestrained. Elizabeth followed it into the kitchen, where Jonathan stood at the counter, sleeves rolled up, attempting breakfast with earnest focus. Noah sat nearby, offering commentary with solemn authority. The scene stopped Elizabeth mid-step, emotion tightening her throat. It was not perfection that moved her. It was normalcy. Jonathan noticed her and smiled briefly. Nothing performative in the gesture. He handed Noah a plate and turned to Elizabeth with the same quiet consideration he always showed. There was no announcement, no declaration of roles. They simply occupied the space together, allowing routines to take shape naturally. Days unfolded into weeks. Elizabeth found herself settling into rhythms she had not known she missed. Morning walks with Noah, afternoons spent reading or tending to small projects around the house, evenings that ended not in exhaustion but in calm. Jonathan's presence was constant yet unobtrusive, offering support without expectation. They spoke openly about boundaries. Elizabeth made it clear that she did not want Noah confused or pressured. Jonathan agreed without hesitation, emphasizing that trust would guide whatever future emerged. There were no assumptions, no timelines imposed, only patience. Noah thrived in the environment. He grew more confident, more expressive, his laughter frequent and unguarded. Jonathan engaged him with genuine interest, answering questions, listening attentively, never asserting authority that had not been invited. The respect he showed the child mirrored the respect he showed Elizabeth. Elizabeth noticed the change in herself gradually. The tension she had carried in her shoulders eased. Her breath came more evenly. She laughed more freely, spoke more openly. The vigilance that had once defined her days softened into awareness without fear. She felt present in her own life again. She began volunteering with a local organization focused on supporting women in crisis. The work was demanding but grounding, offering purpose without spectacle. Elizabeth shared her experience only when asked, framing it as one story among many, rather than a defining identity. She focused on resources, on advocacy, on practical steps forward. Jonathan supported her involvement without reservation. He adjusted his schedule, offered assistance when needed, stepped back when not. He never positioned himself as a savior. He understood that her strength was self-built, and he honored it. There were moments of reflection. Elizabeth sometimes thought about Richard, not with anger, but with a detached awareness that surprised her. The man who had once dominated her life now occupied a distant corner of memory, stripped of power by time and truth. She did not dwell there long. What mattered was the present. Evenings often ended with quiet conversations after Noah had gone to sleep. Elizabeth and Jonathan spoke about books, ideas, the shape of the world beyond their walls. They did not rush toward definitions or labels. The connection between them deepened without demand, grounded in mutual respect rather than need. Elizabeth felt no urgency to name what they were becoming. For the first time, she trusted that clarity would arrive when it was meant to. One afternoon, Noah asked a question that stopped her short. "Is this our home?" he asked, his voice earnest. Elizabeth knelt to his level, meeting his eyes. She considered the weight of the word, the promise it carried. She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "it is." Noah smiled, satisfied, and returned to his game. Elizabeth stood and felt the truth of her answer settle inside her. Home was no longer a place tied to ownership or status. It was safety. It was presence. It was the freedom to exist without fear. Jonathan watched her from across the room, understanding passing between them without words. As night fell, the house filled with a gentle stillness. Elizabeth tucked Noah into bed, listening as he drifted into sleep. She stood for a moment afterward, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, feeling gratitude so deep it was almost overwhelming. Downstairs, Jonathan waited quietly. Lights dimmed, the day complete without ceremony. Elizabeth joined him, settling into the calm they had built together. There was no need to speak, no need to anticipate what came next. The future remained unwritten. But for now, the silence was not empty. It was full of promise, holding steady as the world outside waited, unhurried and quiet. Years passed in a way Elizabeth Warren once believed would never be possible. Not because time erased what had happened, but because she learned to live with the memory without letting it define every breath. The life she built did not come from luck or revenge. It came from choices made quietly, repeatedly, when no one was watching. On a clear Saturday morning, she stood on the back porch and watched Noah run across the lawn. He was older now, taller, faster. His laughter bright and unrestrained as he chased a ball that bounced unpredictably through the grass. The sunlight caught in his hair, and for a moment, Elizabeth felt the simple, undeniable truth of it. He was here. He was healthy. He was safe. Jonathan Reed stood beside her, hands resting lightly on the porch railing. He did not speak immediately. He rarely filled silence, just to prove presence. Over time, that had become one of the things Elizabeth trusted most about him. Noah's voice carried back to them. "Watch this!" he shouted, and then he sprinted, determined to prove something that mattered intensely in the world of childhood. Elizabeth smiled, her shoulders easing as she allowed herself to enjoy the moment without scanning it for danger. A few miles away, the city moved on, as it always did. People went to work, tuned into the news, debated the latest scandal, forgot yesterday's headlines. Richard Coleman's name no longer dominated conversations, It surfaced occasionally in business columns as a cautionary example. A former leader removed by the systems he once commanded. He had become a lesson rather than a legend. Elizabeth did not follow those stories closely. She did not need to. The absence of anger surprised her sometimes. There had been a period when she assumed she would carry bitterness forever, that her heart would harden into something sharp and permanent. Instead, she found that time, purpose, and love did something quieter. They reshaped the pain into memory, and the memory into meaning. One afternoon, Noah asked questions that Elizabeth knew would come eventually. They sat at the kitchen table with a plate of sliced apples between them. Noah's brows were furrowed with serious concentration, his hands resting flat on the wood like he was preparing for an important conversation. Jonathan was in the next room, close enough to hear, far enough to give them space. "Why don't I see my dad?" Noah asked. Elizabeth felt the familiar tightening in her chest, but it did not break her. She had prepared for this moment, not with rehearsed speeches, but with honesty measured to a child's understanding. She looked into Noah's eyes and chose calm. "Because he wasn't able to be a safe parent," she said gently. Noah absorbed that quietly. "Did he hurt you?" Elizabeth paused, then nodded once. "He made choices that left us alone when we needed him," she said. "That was wrong. And you deserved better." Noah's mouth tightened, not with rage, but with the kind of sadness children feel when they learn the world can be unfair. Elizabeth reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "What matters," she continued softly, "is that you are loved. You have always been loved." Noah stared at the apples, then looked up again. "Is Jonathan my dad?" he asked, voice small but steady. Elizabeth's throat tightened. She glanced toward the doorway where Jonathan stood, listening without intruding. Jonathan's expression was calm, his eyes attentive but careful. He had never demanded a title. He had never insisted on a role. He had simply shown up, day after day, in the ways that counted. Elizabeth turned back to Noah. "Jonathan is someone who chose us," she said. "He chose to be here. That's what makes him family." Noah nodded slowly, the answer settling into him. He slipped off his chair and walked into the next room without hesitation, wrapping his arms around Jonathan's waist. Jonathan's hand rested lightly on the back of Noah's head, his gaze lifting toward Elizabeth with quiet emotion. Nothing needed to be said. In the months that followed, Elizabeth continued her work with organizations that supported women facing abandonment, domestic instability, and financial coercion. She spoke at community centers and small town halls, places filled with ordinary people who understood hardship. Older couples sat in folding chairs and listened with solemn attention, often nodding, as if recognizing pieces of their own history in hers. Elizabeth never made her story about humiliation. She made it about dignity. She emphasized practical protections, the importance of healthcare access, and the responsibility society carries toward pregnant women. She spoke about accountability, not as revenge, but as the foundation of trust. Her words were clear, grounded, and deeply American in their insistence that cruelty does not get a free pass simply because it happens behind closed doors. On the anniversary of her return to California, the organization she worked with held a small community event. Nothing glamorous, just a modest gathering in a public park, with tables, warm food, and families who had survived difficult chapters. Elizabeth stood with Noah and Jonathan among them, blending into the crowd not as celebrities, but as people who had rebuilt. An older woman approached Elizabeth near the end of the evening, her hair silver, her posture slightly hunched but strong. She took Elizabeth's hands in both of hers. "My daughter went through something like this," the woman said quietly. "We didn't know how to help her back then. I'm glad you spoke. I'm glad you didn't stay silent." About Sina, Elizabeth swallowed hard, emotion tightening her throat. She nodded, unable to answer right away. The woman squeezed her hands gently, then let go and walked back into the crowd. Elizabeth stood still, watching families laugh under the soft glow of string lights. Noah ran toward a group of children playing tag. Jonathan remained beside her, steady as always. Elizabeth looked out at the gathering, at the people who had chosen to show up for one another, and felt the weight of everything she had survived settle into something resembling peace. In this country, silence in front of cruelty is never neutral. She didn't say it aloud. She didn't have to. The message was already there, hanging in the calm air of the park, carried by laughter, by community, by the kind of restoration that doesn't erase scars, but gives them meaning. And as the lights dimmed and the last conversation softened into quiet, Elizabeth stood with her family and let the night close around them in a gentle, waiting silence.